Hi, I'm Ross Hill, CEO and founder of Insight Forward, and today I'm joined by Dr. Treston Wheat, our Chief Geopolitical Officer, to discuss Insight Forward's top 10 geopolitical risks for businesses in 2025. Okay, so Treston, with our top 10 risks this year, our lead article is that corporations are now essentially geopolitical actors. But can we go into a bit more detail about what we actually mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take a broader understanding of the history, the rise of multinational corporations, because remember, multinational corporations are kind of a 20th century invention as we understand them, even though corporations spanning the globe have been for about 400 years. But multinational corporations rose with the rise of neoliberalism. And so we spread free markets globally, and they were used to operating just essentially as economic actors. But as the world has changed, and we're going to talk about things like great power politics and balkanization of technology, as the world has changed, they have become directly connected to the politics domestically and then geopolitics internationally. And this is why we sort of make the reference to the East India Company, which becomes kind of a paradigm or an archetype of corporations as geopolitical actors.
Mm-hmm. So how can we kind of explain kind of what it means to become a bit more like the East India Company in the context of like contemporary geopolitics? Because obviously, historically, the East India Company, ran its own kind of military, essentially. We don't see companies working towards that. Not at this point, anyway. Who knows for the future? But is there some kind of parallels that we can actually draw that are going to help people understand what we mean by that?
Absolutely. So when I meant paradigm and or archetype, it's very much just a corporation that understands the deep intimacy between politics and markets. And so you're right. Corporations, I mean, maybe in the future, if anyone's seen the television show Continuum, it may be like that eventually. But corporations don't have their own militaries, they're not setting up their own governments. But there are a myriad of current examples from Ukraine to Israel to domestic politics as well, where corporations either are impacted significantly and then they have to respond with their security teams or their marketing teams, or they are directly influencing the politics that are happening. And so they're joining in operations, for example, Ukraine and Israel will do again. Um, Multiple technology companies have actually sided with the Ukrainians against the Russians, and they've been injected into the conflict. So Russia accusing Meta, Facebook of being a terrorist organization, essentially. Starlink
Yeah.
supplying internet to the Ukrainians to help in the war effort, or Microsoft, which has done a significant amount of threat intelligence monitoring on advanced persistent threats, APTs, from Russia, and they've given a tremendous amount of intelligence to the Ukrainian government. So we have corporations actually engaging in an active war, not direct participation the way we would understand soldiers fighting, but
Mm.
through their resources, through their products, they're actually participating in conflict, much like the East India Company did a couple hundred years ago. And so, as we're thinking of the changing sort of geopolitical situation, that's essentially what we mean is corporations are no longer just on the sidelines, they're not passive actors, rather they are directly participating. And this goes beyond just conflict. Conflict is an easy example, but think of domestic politics, particularly in the United States. 8 years ago, during the US presidential election, Meta was accused of not containing disinformation on their platform. Again, sort of from Russia, so it's sort of an extension of that issue. But corporations were accused of supporting certain causes in opposition to politicians. And so they were dragged into domestic politics, even though they just wanted to have a social media company or another
Mm.
kind of tech company. Some corporations have tried to get around this. For example, Microsoft has offered security services to the emails of any party. They've just been nonpartisan with this, but that still puts them directly into the situation as well, even if it's not on a partisan manner.
Okay. So is this kind of reflecting more how important certain companies' products and services have become to governments, rather than that kind of willingness to kind of openly support a government in that way.
I think that's a great question because technology, for example, we focus a lot on the tech sector for kind of obvious reasons because it's permeated every aspect of politics and society. I mean, we all have our smartphones, we all have our laptops, we are digitally connected
Mhm.
24/7. And so tech is an easy one to demonstrate. Without those products and services, we wouldn't have anything. But this goes beyond just say technology. For example, the agriculture sector. The agriculture sector has also experienced the impacts of politics, whether it's fertilizer disruption because of the Ukrainian war, or the need for tech experts and semiconductors because they use so much more technology in
Mhm.
agriculture than they do now, or the specific internal DEI programs of tractor companies has also been connected to political issues and supporting certain social causes in juxtaposition to what their consumer base wants. And so you're absolutely right that like services are a critical part of this, because they're so fundamental to our existence now. Um, and I think it's really important to sort of create a distinction. So you and I have kind of talked about this where I'm an American and I have a very American perspective, and you're
Yeah.
British and you have a very British /
Yeah.
European perspective. And the United States, for good or ill, is far more capitalist in the sense of independence of governments from corporations. And
Mhm.
this is why this trend is particularly interesting. The vast majority of Europe is obviously still capitalist, but Europe has a slightly different history. For example, the ordo liberalism from Wilhelm Röpke's approach in Germany, um, that Ludwig Erhard helped develop post World War II, means the German government has consistently worked closer with corporations. The UK has a slightly different history, with a bit more hostility towards corporations, and sort of innovative capitalism.
Mhm.
But in the US, corporations control, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but control the vast majority of our critical infrastructure, for example, or our technology, or our farming, our housing. And this is why corporations really need to understand these problems and why they directly participate in politics now, because we've chosen a free market system, but that means corporations have an outsized influence on these various aspects of our lives in society.
Yeah, that still causes quite a lot of discussion here. The sort of privatization versus the nationalization of certain services that comes from like our transport network to our water services and other things that you would consider critical infrastructure that certainly, as you say, in the US is almost totally privatized. So that's interesting that even though it's private companies, more private companies now seem to be considered part of critical national infrastructure, whether that's the securitization of those industries to a certain extent because of some of the trade barriers and protectionism and things that we're seeing, or whether actually that is just becoming the case because they are so pervasive across kind of everything we do. So that's kind of like an interesting point. But I think the point being that it's very difficult for companies to separate themselves from state now, regardless of whether you're private or not.
Exactly. Like that's the critical issue, and hence
Mm.
the point to the introductory essay, and why corporations need to think of themselves as something other than just a business or an economic actor. Because they're so fundamentally important to both domestic and local economies and international economies, they participate in and influence and are influenced by politics and geopolitics. They're not separate from this process. And I think that's the needed mindset shift that corporations need to operate more effectively
Mhm.
over the long term. Is you saw, particularly in the United States, corporations were quite flummoxed in 2016 and a little bit after, when they were dragged into electoral politics and
Yeah,
social movements and
yeah,
everything. They were not prepared for that. And I think Susan Gordon, former principal deputy director of the Office of Director of National Intelligence, She brilliantly describes this, how Trump changed this during in his administration, because the intelligence community was basically told, you actually have to include corporate and economic analysis into your security analysis. And she
Mm.
noted how this was a fundamental shift in the
Hmm.
paradigm for the
Yeah.
government's intelligence community. Corporations weren't the only ones surprised. So everyone was kind of shocked at this change into more like the East India Company
Yeah.
style problems.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just government, it wasn't just corporations. And Gordon ultimately went to work for Microsoft after leaving the administration. And I think that's emblematic of this is Microsoft, for example, recognized this sort of change and that they actually needed that kind of
Yeah.
government expertise.
Yeah.
But Microsoft was far from the only one.
Yeah.
I'm just using sort of a high profile example
Hmm.
of this shift because even the government intelligence agencies recognized that we had a paradigm shift and they had to incorporate political economy, market analysis, because that was essential to America's national interests. And I think Europe, again, is a little bit different because they've always had a slightly more corporatist model. So they've taken this stuff into account slightly more. And I'm just
Yeah.
using slightly, like, I don't think they've overwhelmingly done it. The only one who successfully did this, of course, was the British Empire in the 17 and
Yeah.
1800s. They're the only ones who made that. Palmerston critically understood it. But besides
Yeah.
that, everyone was kind of surprised by this sudden change that we had.
Yeah. Interesting. So, this obviously, for us makes us think, okay, well, this is gonna mean some kind of slightly different risks and opportunities for corporations, moving
Mhm.
forward, as this change becomes more and more kind of apparent to people. So, and I know we're going to kind of get into it in a bit, but what kinds of risks or opportunities do you see for corporations now that with that sort of paradigm has shifted?
Yes. So, and I think your question is important in the way it's framed because it's not just risks, it's also
Yeah.
opportunities. And that's the way businesses need to think about this. So, direct risks, of course, are disruptions to the supply chain, um, direct attacks because of extremists or being drawn into conflict or operations there, regulatory changes and monetary changes that are sudden or arbitrary. So there are all kinds of those risks that occur. But understanding themselves as political actors can help in a myriad of ways to open markets or allow corporations to get more entrenched there. Because by recognizing the shifts in geopolitics, they can say, oh, okay, this place, say sub Saharan Africa, is going to open up as a market for us to be able to go to and spend money and develop resources, or certain places in Latin America that wouldn't have been before. And then also, we'll talk about, say, domestic markets, understanding the political connections between their business practices, their uh, products, etc. They can actually help solidify their place in the market and penetrate it further than if they didn't recognize this at all. And so I think the broad framework you've laid out of risks, yes, there are many risks,
Hmm.
but there are many opportunities that come along with recognizing this and being ahead of the curve.
Okay, yeah. So we need to think about that when we think about, geopolitical analysis and what companies are trying to achieve from that. I think it's almost like a natural human condition to be kind of drawn towards the risk side of things and the
Mhm.
negatives, and look for those when in fact should be incorporating both risks and opportunities, really understanding kind of what your organization is about, where it sits, how that affects itself as a geopolitical actor, and then how that can be used to either mitigate risk or identify opportunity.
Invariably. And I think a fundamental aspect of, say, geopolitical risk analysis is understanding costs and benefits. Because exactly as you said, we're all human. We tend towards the pessimistic and the negative. Um, uh, but every action in the world essentially has costs and benefits. And this is the point of really good geopolitical risk analysis is it's not just about the costs. It's not just about the risks. in and of themselves. But by understanding the costs and understanding the risks, you can then mirror this to the benefits and opportunities. And so we will talk about great power politics and shifts in the US China relationship, but that creates opportunities as well. The movement of friendshoring, if you understand how the US government, for example, is promoting friendshoring, you can
Hmm.
be ahead of the curve and set up supply chains and manufacturing before other corporations do, and have cheaper labor, lower regulatory costs, etc. And so it actually creates opportunities for you by understanding these potential risks as well.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of transition into our
Okay.
next section, where we're actually going to kind of go through this year's report that we've created and some of those risks that we've seen. Right, okay, so we're going to move on now and talk about some of the actual risks that we are highlighting in this year's report. And I think one of the themes we looked at when we created the report was actually, how interconnected all of those risks are.
Mhm.
Um, Starting with the main one, which we're calling out, which is great power politics. And we've written about this quite a lot over the last year or so anyway, and talked about it a lot. Um, and we sort of, when we started doing that, we thought about it as like the revenge of geopolitics, we called
Yeah.
it, because it felt like we'd sort of shifted from maybe what felt like lots of things around international security issues. We might have used that terminology rather than geopolitics, or just pure kind of security issues rather than those kind of overarching big issues. So,
Mhm.
why do we now think about it as the revenge of geopolitics?
So, as we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, multinational corporations arose really in the world of neoliberalism. And a critical aspect of neoliberalism was globalization and interconnectedness. And so we believed in this almost teleological Francis Fukuyama kind of
Mm.
paradigm
Yeah,
where the
yeah, yeah.
world was getting closer together. We were integrating markets,
Mhm.
and it was for a while. But then the revenge of geopolitics was and is these long term historical forces came back from underneath. There was only a veneer of market integration, nationalism, religion, historical grievances. This was all underneath the whole time. And by ignoring it or being unaware that it existed, we saw this stuff rise back up. And the traditional forms of geopolitics are essentially returning because of these long term historical trends and grievances. But then also, not just that, major events over the last 20 years has shifted people's understanding of foreign policy, geopolitics, etc. The Iraq War, for example, the financial crisis, the rise of China, these were events that were going to happen irrespective of the historical stuff. And when they happened, they fractured our understanding of foreign policy. They're fractured the idea of interconnectedness, of spreading democracy, and in so doing, the revenge of geopolitics is the hearkening back to the historical paradigm of nation states seeking their national interests,
Mm.
potential hegemonic pursuits, focusing on your people, quote unquote, against the other people. And rather than having the idea of rising tide raising all boats, no, it's I need to get mine, etc., all coming together. And then the two big trends that come along with this is you mentioned great power politics. That's absolutely one of them. Because we saw peer competitors to the United States and other countries rising. So China and Russia are relatively obvious, but the EU as a supranational peer competitor, Brazil, India, etc., attempting great power status to secure their own interests, both market and security. And in so doing, they challenged the sort of Washington consensus.
Mm.
Um, and where this goes together is deglobalization. So the fracturing I talked about that allowed these long-term historical underpinnings to rise makes all the risks we talk about in this report deeply connected to each other, because you have the risks kind of under great power politics and deglobalization, but then they intermingle with each other as well. And so, because it's the trends going together that we see this happening.
Yeah. So it's kind of it's an interesting sort of paradox to me that deglobalization creates more interconnected
Mhm.
risks. And so, like, I was trying to think about, trying to kind of understand that myself of why we think that. And the best analogy I could come up with is because the system is not collapsing like a house of cards. It's not just a completely bursting wide open. It's this kind of unpicking of the knots of globalization where they were tied together. But seemingly, what's happened is you like as you unpick one knot to disconnect, it creates kind of a knot somewhere else and an issue somewhere else. And that's the kind of thread now that I've been following in that. And then I think, when we talk about great power politics, I mean the obvious one causing the greatest issues at the moment are the competition between US and China. So just from you, really, from what your perspective is, what does that mean for kind of like the year ahead and beyond, I suppose?
Yeah, so the US and China competition is central to our understanding of both deglobalization and great power politics,
Mm.
because we've realized that helping each other doesn't really secure our own interests. And that's the problem. And so corporations have particularly seen the impacts of this really post COVID. Post COVID, or COVID was a catalyst for us to recognize that essentially we're going to start decoupling. And as soon as we were competing with each other, this was most likely going to happen. This isn't new to history. We've seen this kind of great power competition and decoupling and separation in everything from the British and French empires, then the Napoleonic period, up through the 20th century. So this is nothing new, but we have to accept that it's happening. And so the US and China are going to try and balance against each other. That's naturally what great powers do when they're in competition. And that balancing is going to require, for example, cutting off certain resources. And so the West has attempted export bans on semiconductors, for example, that China desperately needs. So China is several years behind on advanced semiconductors because of this. They weren't able to develop their own domestic industry. And so they're struggling needing the kind of advanced ones. But it's also corporations pulling out of China because of the increased totalitarianism there and the arbitrariness, and then it's no longer cost effective. And then they may increasingly face sanctions. So people are pulling out their manufacturing or investment because it's not really worth it either. So we're seeing this decoupling in economic terms, but then also in more focused area, we're also seeing the balkanization of
Mm.
technology, in which, because of the kinds of export bans or investment changes, research not being done simultaneously together, we're seeing the US, the West, including Japan, um, develop their own technologies and internets, essentially. And China is now doing the same with its own. Operating systems and cell phones, for example, was an issue a couple of years ago, where China is focusing on a domestic version of theirs. And then you have the security aspect too of this as well. It's not just the corporations and not just the economic interests, but balkanization of tech refers to, say, like the splitting of the internet. And China's Great Firewall means that we're moving towards corporations and then governments generally and people generally having actual separate internets. And
Mm.
so we're seeing the great power competition with balancing and export bans impacting the deglobalization and the decoupling and the splitting of the internet and the balkanization of technology. And it's all interconnected. You can't separate out one of these without understanding the other ones as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen that, I suppose we refer to it as a balkanization of tech, with companies not releasing certain new products in certain markets because of regulatory issues. I think a couple of the major tech companies, I think it was maybe Apple and Facebook, didn't release some of their artificial intelligence models or products directly into the European market initially because there were some like barriers to kind of get past before they felt like they could do that successfully. So I feel like it extends. We talk about it a lot in terms of like China and the US, but it does extend it across kind of many markets.
Definitely. And like this is why I mentioned like the EU as a supranational peer competitor, because no single European country could possibly come close as a peer competitor.
Hmm.
But together they actually have significant economic power
Yeah.
and regulatory power. And so we talked, this is just a minute ago, we talked about the US China great power competition. But the EU and the US don't always agree on a lot of things, despite being the West, quote
Yeah, yeah,
unquote. There's quite a bit of divergence between the various aspects. And I think this is another example of how even sort of intra blocks, and I mean that as sort of the economic or political bloc, can have disagreements as well. And that's where we're seeing this rendering of deglobalization impact further. So the EU has passed a number of data privacy laws and data security laws because of the EU's understanding of what the consumer's privacy should be. Okay, understandable. But you're now seeing a particular negative impact in that it over-regulated the market. And American technology companies aren't wanting to deal with these kinds of regulations that are essentially anti-innovation. And so they're pulling out as well. And so the EU, I think, is going to face a lot of different risks, in particular with deglobalization, because they don't necessarily want to turn to China either. Some countries
mm,
have, some corporations have, but take again semiconductors, the Dutch government has been enforcing export bans. And so you're seeing the decoupling between Europe and China as well. And so this deglobalization, this balkanization is truly global. It's not like it's going to be, in the Cold War where we have two competing blocks.
yeah,
It's going to be multipolar. It's going to have
yeah,
blocks all over the world.
yeah. That and yeah, that's just what I was going to kind of come in with actually. That multipolarity that we're seeing that some countries, particularly Russia, is actively pursuing. It's been really interesting to follow the Russian narrative over the
Mm-hmm.
last few months or so, where anytime they kind of hold big trade missions or whatever it is, they're specifically using the term to create a multipolar world. I think Russia recognizing that on its own it can't challenge either the US or China, and needs to form kind of smaller blocks in order to exert more power in that way. So lots of kind of different kind of impacts we're seeing driven by the great power politics. And although we and lots of others, we always talk about US and China because of the two bigger
Mm-hmm.
powers, we can't forget that it's impacting everybody. And I think one of the regions we're actually seeing one of the bigger impacts on is actually kind of the global south and
Mm-hmm.
Latin America and Africa particularly, largely because they have some of the natural resources that are becoming kind of more critical. So, can we just kind of dive a little bit deeper into that? um, what can we expect for the global south? Why is this changing? What natural resources do they have that people want, and why, and what kind of impacts can we expect to see?
Yeah, and I think that's such a great example because it connects some of the various threads we've been talking about. So because you have great power competition, because you have deglobalization, you see this rise of multipolarity. As you just put, it's been central to Russian foreign policy, but it's also just a general trend and harkens back to what we were talking about, how the revenge of geopolitics is taking us back to the 1700s, 1800s understanding of geopolitics and foreign policy. And so, what's important about this is in a non interconnected economic system, you're going to have significantly greater competition for natural resources. For us now, this could be everything from quartz to copper to gallium to lithium, essential elements of technology, because technology is in everything from cars to tractors to light bulbs. We need this natural resources. However, as part of the kind of deglobalization aspect, we're seeing the rise of instability in the global south because many of these countries have been quote unquote losers in the economic competition. They've been exploited by various countries over a long period of time. They've had a real trouble rooting out corruption, overcoming left wing governments that were relatively hostile to markets, etc. And then, of course, the internecine conflicts, say like in the DRC. that's causing problems. And so here's where it relates to great power politics. Russia, US, China, EU, all has to compete in these countries to try and get access to the natural resources needed to fund the modern economics. And so in trying to compete with each other, they're operating in a very high risk environment. Now, cleverly, several of these countries have used that to their advantage with getting China's Brick and Road Initiative, for example, building a lot of infrastructure in Africa. Certain African countries using the Russian Wagner Group or its latest iteration in their security issues in order to give concessions there. But that doesn't negate the fundamental instability that we're seeing, both from a market perspective and a security perspective. Because again, these fundamental historical issues that we talked about, these underlying trends have not gone away. So it's not that suddenly peace broke out in sub-Saharan Africa. M23 and DRC is still very much fighting. Ethiopia is having a contentious issue with Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
Rwanda is having issues with the DRC. We had multiple coups over the last 5 years. And then you say move to like Latin America, where we have um, sort of disruptions in Brazil because of slight political instability and shifts between far left governments and far right governments, or even sort of positive changes, but still very, very disruptive. Take Bukele and in El Salvador, who essentially arrested 1% of the population. And this caused a massive decline in gang activity and murders, but he violated quite a few human rights in order to make that happen. So you still see this sort of instability that has to be overcome while they're trying to get the competition between the great powers to work in their favor.
Yeah, interesting. Like when you think about some of those resources that are becoming more critical now, obviously we've had a long period where oil or gas, energy was always considered kind of the most critical resource, I suppose, and Russia always used that to its advantage pretty well. So it'll be interesting to see how some of those countries, if they can kind of overcome maybe some of their domestic instability, do they start to use, do you have like lithium politics, for example, where they start to use access to whatever resources they've got, to create a more favorable environment for themselves, geopolitically. So that would be interesting to kind of take a look at. But one of the things pick up on when you talked about the African governments in particular, in more working with Russia more closely, and one of the things we picked out this year was Western corporations maybe having more trouble in accessing African markets, partly because of the kind of anti-liberal backlash that we actually see in Africa. So, what do we mean when we say there's that kind of anti-liberal backlash going on?
Definitely. So, although this is controversial to talk about, it's important for us to acknowledge the risks. One of the most influential sort of areas is LGBTQ politics. And lots of African countries feel that Western liberals are imposing their secular values onto these countries that are generally deeply religious. And in doing so, they're turning away from the West because they're basically telling Western governments in particular, you don't get to impose your secular values onto us. That's neocolonialism. We're not accepting it. And an easy example of this is Uganda.
Mm.
Uganda criminalized homosexual acts, and the World Bank basically said, "Hey, you can't do that. Like we're going to cut funding." And Uganda said, "Okay, cut funding. Like we're keeping our traditions, we're keeping our values. You're not allowed to impose on us." And so we're seeing this broader trend. Again, using LGBTQ politics, but like that's not the only aspect to it. The
Yeah.
irreligious nature of a lot of Western foreign policy grates on them. So one of the things we see, as you kind of pointed out, is Russia using the Orthodox Church, for example,
Mm.
to promote connections with other Christian groups in Africa, and therefore creating a more intimate connection between Russia as a great power in these African countries because they're willing to overtly use religion. And so this anti liberal backlash is part of the sort of cultural rejection. We're seeing the economic rejection, of course, in a variety of ways, competing with Russia, China,
Mm.
etc. But the cultural, the social aspect, the religious aspect is going to influence governments, African governments' decisions as well. Because remember, they have their own domestic audiences. These are
Yeah,
not
yeah,
just
yeah.
like leaders who get to decide whatever they want. They have to appease their populations just like our governments have to appease their populations. But their populations are more overtly religious and therefore more traditional. And Western liberalism has become very much anathema to their way of life. And so by rejecting it, they may very well reject corporations. There have been instances, for example, of certain NGOs posting pro LGBT politics in one area of the world and then being either harassed or attacked in other parts of the world where it was illegal. And so corporations that may
Mm.
be overtly socially liberal in the United States or Europe, African corporations or African governments may look at that and be like, you know what, we don't want your values.
Mm.
We're going to turn to either China or Russia. China, because they're agnostic about how we practice our
Yeah,
religion, and
yeah,
Russia because they support the way we practice our religion.
yeah. There's kind of it sort of reminds me when we used to talk about it in terms of almost like a rejection of democratic values as well,
Mm,
where and the same would be said for or human rights or something like that, because you'd say well, China would be more prepared to overlook
mm,
the democratic values of a country or maybe the human rights issues in a country to work with that country, where other countries in the West would try and impose their own democratic and other types of values. So you talked about the economic rejection. We could talk about a slight democratic rejection and now a cultural rejection of everything in the West. And you can see how that starts to make it much more difficult for Western corporations to operate successfully in those markets without, obviously, without adapting and operating, quite differently to how they might do in other regions.
most assuredly. And this is not a new issue for anyone familiar with like the Kirkpatrick doctrine of the 1980s, recognizing that other countries have different forms of governments, different culture, and to be more successful, you might have to look the other way or accept that they're going to be different. But this also comes to our broad theme corporations get to make their own decisions as well. They're
Mm.
rational actors.
Mm.
And they may very well say our values as a company matter more than any potential profit in this area. Now, this may actually help with domestic markets because domestic markets are becoming increasingly polarized. But they're going to have to learn to navigate, again, both the risks and opportunities of this.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Like, how do you cope with a backlash from your domestic consumer base versus what you need to do for an international consumer base? It's going to be some challenging times with that within that, and we can talk a little bit about polarization shortly. Okay, so if we move on from those kind of like big, great power politics issues and kind of the different challenges that makes, we've had very, very high inflation, at least in the Western world and other places for a couple of years now. Um, but we're seeing sort of monetary policy change. And I think that could cause some kind of significant challenges. Can we go into a bit more kind of detail on that?
Sure. So, related to the decoupling, the supply chain disruptions, inflation, which just mean consumer good prices are going up. And the role of central banks is to control inflation and maximize employment. But there are trade offs for what has to happen. Again, costs and benefits always throughout this analysis. And the West, not just the West, Japan is a prime example of this.
Mm.
For more than a decade, everyone basically relied on extremely low or 0% interest rate because this was basically free money to develop corporations, to expand operations. Um, and then Japan, when they had negative interest rates, you kind of made money with loans. And so it was used to exchange currencies quite often. But inflation, the mass inflation that sort of happened after COVID, changed their approach. And so it's going back to sort of more normalcy. And by normalcy, I mean, say 30-ish years ago, in which they need to contain inflation. So that means higher interest rates. Now, the US has just cut interest rates. The ECB is likely going to cut soon because inflation has declined
Yeah.
sufficiently enough. And Japan roiled from their interest rate increase. But considering all the various issues that are going on, for example, the port workers strike that
Mm.
has supposedly ended, but they're still going to be debating automation until January 15th. So it could actually come back. That could have led to significant inflation over the medium term in the US and Europe because European markets would have absolutely been disrupted by the port strike, particularly the German automobile industry. And so what would have happened then if inflation jumps up again? Either, they'll have to stop cutting rates, and so it'll just stay higher than normal for a couple more years, or they might have to raise rates again. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around monetary policy over the next couple of years because we haven't settled the supply chain problem. We haven't settled the
Mm.
inflation problem. And inflation, you want about 2% because you want relative currency stability. You don't want inflation or you don't want deflation and you don't want high inflation. So you seek about
Yeah.
2%. And we're
Yeah.
kind of getting there. We're almost there. But shocks to the system that we talk about could significantly increase inflation again, and monetary policy will have to change.
Yeah. Definitely, that doesn't feel like it's over. It feels pretty fragile, the inflationary system at the moment. And I think there's,
Mhm.
plenty of conflict and other issues going on that could have some big impacts there. Okay. And so, kind of going, or I suppose continuing to talk about markets in a way, but, a couple of the other risks that we're really seeing and focusing on over the next year are the rise we're seeing in political nationalism. And then I think quite interconnected to that is like the polarization of domestic markets. Um, so let's maybe start with nationalism, something that I think, particularly looking at in the EU or in Europe, driven by a number of different things, far right parties performing much better in elections, you know, surprise wins in kind of election after election, really. But can we talk about kind of why we think we're starting to see that rise in nationalism, or maybe not starting to see it? It's probably been a bit of a trend over a little bit of time, but actually starting to really see what we would consider far right parties really come to prominence in kind of national and kind of regional or local elections.
Yeah, and I think this connects again to say like the anti-liberal backlash that we see in
Mm.
Africa. We're seeing something similar in the West, and that's where we're seeing the rise of nationalism. Is groups within countries, particularly the US and the EU, are basically tired of being accused of a whole set of nefarious things. And so the support for far right policies has increased because that's sort of the expanding aspect where people could draw on that audience. But then there have also been some major policy mistakes from governments that have had negative impacts on particular groups of the population. And then those groups of the population were ignored. So EU regulations, climate regulations, for example, led to the farmer protests that sort of spread across Europe. Immigration policy very much led to a cultural backlash throughout Europe. A lot of European countries were tired of the EU telling them what they could or couldn't do. This is Italy, Hungary, Poland, saying again that sort of cultural thing of like, you don't get to dictate everything to us. And then in the US, more so than I think Europe, to go back to some of the major policy failures, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, really broke the idea of the US needing to support interventionism, the US needing to
Mm.
support global markets. And a lot, you assess the sort of polling, but you look at like the interviews and the surveys, and people are like, why isn't my government taking care of me? They're sending money
Mm.
to Ukraine, they're sending money to Israel. And you've seen this meme sort of spread recently of like, they're doing that. And then why are they only giving $750 to people in Appalachia who were just impacted by the hurricane? And so it's this like, why is my government choosing these people over me? Now, we could talk about like the policy choices and the costs and benefits, et cetera, from a policy perspective. But it's important to remember voters have to rely on certain signals. And so they're seeing these signals that are saying cost of living is going up, housing is going up. Um, you're rejecting my cultural values. You're imposing these regulations that are hurting my business and hurting my life. Why shouldn't I reject your broader set of values? And this is why I think we're seeing like the kind of rise in nationalism is because you used to have just this sort of small core of nationalists or far right parties, but their message is far more palatable because of these significant policy failures throughout the US and the EU.
Yeah, and I guess the far right parties themselves have been pretty successful at sort of shaping their message
Hmm.
towards that proportion of the population that has those feelings about how things are going. And lots of them have tried to kind of edge away from some of their more extreme views
Yeah.
that they've been associated with in the past to try and come back a bit to just try and hit what they see as are important issues and what they kind of feel and see other people are saying are important issues.
Hmm.
And I think some of the other parties have not been as successful as adapting their policies or their messaging, to be able to kind of do that in the same way. Um, Ignoring kind of like the extreme right stuff here that we also see, but certainly, definitely some of the parties really that you previously might have considered extreme right have kind of sort of toned down their message in order to kind of win a bigger share of the popular vote, I think, within that.
Definitely.
But that. So we see that sort of rise in nationalism, the differing of kind of opinion in how people feel like domestic policy is going versus what is happening, and that's sort of difficult for companies to kind of navigate as well. We start to see the polarization in the population directly impacting consumer choice,
Hmm.
and actually choosing to buy products or services from a company because people feel like there's shared values there, not just about because they think you've got the best product or service anymore. And there are kind of many examples that we've seen recently of that, both I think domestically is quite pronounced in probably more pronounced in the US, I would say, than I've
Hmm.
seen across Europe. But also there are geopolitical things occurring that are having the same effect as well as that.
Hmm. Yeah, and so I agree with you that the US market is increasingly polarized, and I think it's related to our discussion about the rise of nationalism. Politics is changing, and people are becoming more hardened on their views because they, for example, the nationalists or right-wing populists are rejecting wholesale liberal values. We use the term illiberalism, and illiberalism isn't necessarily authoritarianism, but a rejection of what we have understood for the last 200 years of a liberal society. And so that has led to this sort of hardening. And then you see the rise of also sort of postmodern liberalism that takes a similar attitude as the right wing populists. And we see this from the survey data where people no longer just view their political opposition as, oh, they have slightly different values than me, or they interpret data differently than me. We actually see that they hate each other. They believe if you
Yeah.
disagree with me, you are morally repugnant. We see this from all kinds of surveys. And then we see the rise of the risk of political violence because of this. The polling shows, the surveys show a significant increase in the use of violence to secure the interests of your community, basically. And so corporations have had to face major reputational issues when they enter those like political
Mm.
discussions. The most obvious example, but it's still so salient, is the Bud Light, where Dylan Mulvaney, a trans influencer, held up a specialized can of Bud Light, and right wing critics went crazy and started boycotting the company, and it actually worked. And so this was the reason
Mm.
it's salient is boycotts overwhelmingly don't work, but they might actually increasingly work now. So Bud Light was an easier boycott because they had alternatives, Coors Light, Modelo. And so their sales dropped 25% and haven't recovered. But polarization may actually make boycotts more effective because you're going to be willing to sacrifice and not purchase products or services if you are ideologically opposed. And so this is where we're seeing the major concern is corporations choosing to try and navigate this polarization. Even if, and this is the difficult and ironic part of it, you may also be punished for not being openly political and openly
Mm.
supportive. And
Yeah.
so it's going to be a very difficult needle to thread. And corporations will probably have to make choices of how they want to do this. What is their consumer base? What is a possible consumer base? How penetrated are they into the market, etc.?
Yeah. And I think geopolitically, things like the Russia-Ukraine conflict first, and the companies that were slow to leave the Russian market after Russia invaded Ukraine were heavily, heavily criticized. Um, despite kind of some saying we're a food producer, this directly affects the people in Russia if we were to leave. It's not as
Mhm.
simple as just like dumping everything and exiting the market. And then that followed with also the Israel Hamas conflict, again with people making comments, either pro-Israeli or anti-Israeli comments, or pro-Palestinian comments, however you want to describe those, actually kind of receiving kind of threats because of the comments they made
Mhm.
about that war. Um, and so a lot happens domestically, of course, but can't forget how you respond to different things going on in the world will also impact, how you're perceived in your particular market, or how you're perceived by your consumers or your clients.
And not just the market, by the way, employees.
Oh
This is
yeah,
the
that's yes, good
the
one, good point.
problem with polarization. We
Mm.
saw employee protests over the Israel-Palestine issue. Google ended up firing like 50 people over this particular problem of employee activism and protests. And so polarization is actually creating insider threats for corporations that they didn't necessarily have to contend with before.
Yeah, so, and I know something you pointed out in the past is looking at the large student protests that we saw that were anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, however you want to describe that. Those students, a lot of them are now entering the workforce. So I think it's
Mhm.
kind of, obviously people do change and their opinions change, but it's reasonable to assume that some of them will take those viewpoints into the workforce as well. So again, people's own personal politics are much more pronounced in the workforce than they used to be. I think the workplace used to be kind of like politically neutral.
Mhm.
I don't think we can really necessarily say that's exactly the same now.
Yeah, I don't think it's politically neutral at all anymore. And that's exactly what we're talking about
Mm.
as well, is because corporations are now so connected with political issues, the work space is now political as well, for good or ill. Again, because this could relate to corporate values or interests,
Yeah.
a whole sort of thing. But we do have to recognize the potential threats or disruptions that can actually come from this as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, of course, a number of companies have actually been very successful in positioning themselves, you know, as a particular to or promote themselves to a particular group in a particular market,
Hmm.
um, one political side or the other. It's not just on any one side. So there are, like you say, there is opportunity within that as
Hmm.
well, depending on kind of how you want to position yourself.
Coffee
Um,
companies, I think, is such a great
yeah,
example of exactly what you're
yeah,
talking about. We have
yeah,
the liberal coffee companies and we have
yeah.
the conservative coffee companies. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I wasn't going to name any names there. uh, okay, so that polarization, the nationalism, political instability, and all those other geopolitical forces, we do think that this is creating now direct physical security risks for
Hmm.
corporations, with one of the big ones that we're highlighting this year being assassinations. when we've looked at the data, the trend does appear to be that over time assassinations are increasing again. And well, we've seen the two. Was the second one? Do we really call the second one against Trump an attempt? I don't know, but the first one
Yeah.
certainly. The second one, you could refer to that as an attempted assassination, but it was foiled at a very critical
Mhm.
point there. So we are experiencing that. We are seeing that. Um, can we talk a little bit about what we think is happening there, and what that really does mean for kind of corporations, I suppose, and maybe corporate executives or CEOs, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so to go back again to the polarization thing, because I think that forms the kind of basis of what
Mm.
we're talking about, where people increasingly view violence as legitimate, political violence as legitimate. And because of that, they are more likely to take direct action. Because if you believe, for example, Trump is a potential dictator, it legitimizes your action. Now, I don't think the first assassination attempt with that. Based on the assailant's profile, it seemed this was more like a publicity kind of John Hinckley Jr. kind of assassination attempt. But we see these kinds of assassinations occurring globally. It's not just within the United States, even though the recent
Mm.
Trump attempts is comes to everyone's mind. But a couple years ago, we had the Shinzo Abe assassination.
Yeah,
And that was shocking to everyone. First of all, because he used a 3D printed gun. And Japan is obviously not known for its political violence. So we're seeing these assassination attempts not just in the
yeah,
US, not just in the West. We've seen a significant increase in assassination attempts in Latin America, but also Asia now. And the forces driving everything we're talking about is a contributing factor. I don't want to say it's the primary one, but it's definitely a contributing factor to the rise of political violence generally, domestic terrorists and extremist groups, but specifically targeted assassinations of political leaders. And this is where we get concerned about corporations as geopolitical actors, is if you now become associated with a particular political position, political party, geopolitical issue, you legitimately could become targets. And corporations have been targets of terrorist attacks already. We have the YouTube shooting from 2018. We have the weird attempt to blow up AWS cloud services in Virginia. The FBI stopped that before it even got close. So we already see the sort of political violence and terrorism that is targeted corporations, but we are assessing that there's an increased risk to CEOs or C-suite people individually because they can become representative of or symbols of these partisan political problems.
yeah. And I think the good example recently as well is the German CEO of the company that
Mhm.
was supplying the military and defense services to Ukraine, supposedly being targeted in a Russian assassination attempt.
Mhm.
So any well, we're going to say like all companies now really are geopolitically involved, I suppose. But
Mhm.
certainly there are some sectors and some situations where there probably is a slightly increased risk of that
Oh yeah.
defense, and particularly connections to Ukraine, and the war there is a, a kind of good one to sort of focus on, I suppose.
Mhm.
All right, and then I guess finally, um, our sort of last one in our list of risks is AI enabled attacks,
Yeah.
cyber attacks. Cyber attacks, obviously, going on for a long time, some hugely impactful. But how is AI actually changing that threat?
Mhm. So cyber attacks are obviously a perennial issue. Everything from ransomware to business email compromise. Corporations have dealt with this for quite a while. AI enabled cyber attacks, though, are going to be slightly different in a couple ways. One, um, say like ChatGPT or something, can easily write a script. And so script kiddies, that's our term for people who are attempting to be hackers but not very good at it yet, can have a lot more development in their code than previously would have been able to. And so they can use AI to write a significant portion of the code for them that can be significantly more sophisticated than before. So part of like this trend is you're just going to have to assume more sophistication rather than just from APTs, advanced persistent
Right.
threats.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then connected to this as well is social engineering. So one of the easiest sort of defenses we had against phishing attacks or social engineering attacks was poorly constructed English, Cyrillic scripts, things that made it easily noticeable that this person wasn't who they said they were. AI, now you can just type it into an AI or large language model, and it'll put out a grammatically correct script for you to use in a social engineering attack. And so it, it creates an added layer of sophistication
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
all potential attacks. And that's really where the big risk comes
Yeah.
from. Is it's no longer about stopping, these low-level ransomware
Mm.
or random phishing attempts. No, you are now going to have to approach cybersecurity that all potential hackers, hacktivists, nation state actors will have a layer of sophistication that they didn't have before.
Yeah. Interesting. That's even now the most basic threat actor is potentially far more
Yeah.
sophisticated than they've ever been. So just even detecting attacks in the first place, and there's been some pretty high profile kind of phishing and
Hmm.
impersonation, deepfake type attacks already that have had some quite significant financial value to them.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I guess that exists within the whole kind of spectrum of everything that we've
Hmm.
we've talked about already, and includes things like mis and disinformation that fuels some of the other risks that we've talked about.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've gone through why geopolitics is so important for corporations now. We've gone through, in quite in depth, I think, what we think the main risks are. But how do we suggest that corporations actually respond to this sort of theme of being a geopolitical actor?
Well, most importantly, is to start incorporating geopolitical risk analysis into their calculations, business, economic, personal security, physical security, cybersecurity, etc. They need to increase significantly their expertise in geopolitics, which can come from in-house or most likely third party, because most businesses are not used to this. And so by incorporating geopolitical risk analysis at multiple levels in multiple areas, they will consistently apply it as a variable in what will offer risks and opportunities. And then that's the sort of second part of making sure to operate this way is by having geopolitical risk analysis as part of their business decision making, their security decision making. It goes back to exactly what we were saying at the beginning. There are risks and there are opportunities. And so, as corporations are thinking about working through this problem, they need to have that framework. This is not just about, oh, woe is us because US China is decoupling, we can't have manufacturing there. It's okay, we can accept that. And so, what are the opportunities? Mexico, Vietnam, that we can move into and operate significantly more effectively. And then sort of a last point to this is corporations are not necessarily good at long-term thinking. It's the next quarter, it's the next fiscal year. It makes sense from a business perspective. To do geopolitical risk well and to understand their roles as geopolitical actors, they're going to have to learn to think in a longer time frame, multiple years, even up to a decade of how they could be impacted or impact various decisions and how there will be indicators along the way of the type of path that geopolitics will take. So corporations need to assess in a long-term capacity if they want to be significantly more effective and take the opportunities that are available to them.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I mean, that takes us through our view on what the top 10 geopolitical risks are for 2025 and beyond. We hope everybody found this useful in some way, and look out for further content coming soon.